Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the blood-soaked reality of Vlad the Impaler. Not the Hollywood vampire with the dramatic cape and the charming accent, but the actual historical nightmare who made the Roman legions look like a weekend camping trip. The man who turned creative brutality into a science and proved that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who get results. So before we journey into the forests of 15th century Wallachia, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're brave enough to stick around for stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about effective leadership. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and whether you're prepared to discover that some historical figures are infinitely worse than your darkest imagination could conjure. Now dim the lights, maybe pour something strong, and let's explore together why Vlad the Impaler wasn't just a madman with a hobby. He was a coldly rational ruler whose methods worked so horrifyingly well that we're still trying to process the implications 5 centuries later. You think you know evil. Adorable. Like thinking a paper cut prepares you for open heart surgery. You think you know Vlad the Impaler. You've seen the movies, read the Wikipedia article, maybe caught a History Channel documentary between episodes about ancient aliens. You picture a brooding castle, dramatic cape swirling, perhaps some theatrical fangs, and a Romanian accent thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Maybe you imagine him as some medieval goth kid who took his angst too far, or a misunderstood ruler who just had some unconventional hobbies involving pointy sticks. You're adorable. The reality of Vlad the Third Dracula, voivode of Wallachia, wasn't a Hollywood villain with a flair for the dramatic. He wasn't some tortured anti-hero wrestling with his dark nature while brooding photogenically in candlelit chambers. He was something far worse than your sanitized, romanticized nightmares could conjure a methodical, intelligent, and utterly remorseless architect of human suffering who treated cruelty not as a passion, but as a precise instrument of statecraft. Picture this, it's 1448, and you're a 14-year-old boy being handed the throne of a kingdom that exists purely because bigger, meaner kingdoms haven't gotten around to erasing it from the map yet. Wallachia sits between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary like a nervous chihuahua between two Rottweilers. Your father was murdered. Your older brother was tortured to death and buried alive. Your younger brother has already switched sides more times than a weather vane in a tornado. The Ottomans want to turn your country into a nice vacation spot with better taxes. The Hungarians want to turn your country into a nice vacation spot with different taxes. The local nobility want to turn your country into their personal piggy bank with you as a decorative but powerless figurehead. Most teenagers would crack under this pressure. Most would flee or compromise, or find some way to play all sides while keeping their head attached to their shoulders. Vlad took a different approach. He looked at this impossible situation and thought, I know exactly how to fix this. I'll make everyone so absolutely terrified of me that they'll forget they ever wanted to mess with my kingdom. And then he set about doing exactly that, with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would make a German efficiency expert weep with joy. Let's start with the impaling, shall we? Because that's what everyone knows about, even if they don't really understand it. You think impaling is just sticking someone on a spike and calling it a day. Quick, brutal, done. The medieval equivalent of a really aggressive parking ticket. Wrong again. Vlad's version of impaling was an art form, a science, and a theological statement all rolled into one horrifying package. The stakes weren't just random pieces of wood. They were carefully crafted instruments of prolonged agony, sanded smooth so they wouldn't catch and tear, rounded at the tip so they would slide rather than puncture. The angle had to be perfect, too steep, and death came too quickly, too shallow and the victim might slide off. The placement required anatomical knowledge that would impress a surgeon, missing vital organs just enough to keep the victim alive for hours, sometimes days. The stake would be inserted through the rectum, or for variety, through other orifices, then slowly guided up through the body cavity, carefully threaded between organs, emerging somewhere around the shoulder or through the mouth. The victim's own weight would gradually pull them down onto the stake, creating a slow, agonizing descent into death. Sometimes Vlad would oil the stakes. Sometimes he would dull them deliberately. Sometimes he would have them planted at different angles to create artistic arrangements of human suffering. He once impaled an entire Ottoman army, not the soldiers, mind you, but the camp followers, the merchants, the translators, the diplomats, anyone who had the misfortune of being associated with the force that had come to collect tribute. 20,000 people, arranged in concentric circles around his capital city, their screams audible for miles. The invading army took one look at this forest of human agony and decided they had urgent business elsewhere. But here's the thing that really separates Vlad from your garden variety psychopath. He wasn't doing this because he enjoyed it. Contemporary accounts describe him eating meals calmly while surrounded by impaled victims, not because he was savoring their suffering, but because he was conducting business. The screaming was background noise. The dying was just Tuesday. He had meetings to attend, treaties to negotiate, taxes to collect. When diplomatic envoys came to his court, he would greet them warmly, offer them food and wine, discuss trade agreements and political alliances, all while the view from his dining hall windows showed hundreds of people in various stages of dying on stakes. If the diplomats seemed uncomfortable, he would apologize for the distraction and suggest they try the roast beef. If they continued to seem distracted by the chorus of agony outside, he might offer to have the victims' tongues removed so dinner could proceed in peace. This wasn't madness. This was policy. Vlad understood something about power that most rulers of his era missed entirely. Fear is infinitely more efficient than force. You can maintain an army to intimidate your enemies, but armies cost money, require food, need training, and might decide they like the other guy's offer better. Fear, properly applied, maintains itself. One spectacularly horrific example could prevent a dozen future conflicts. One carefully orchestrated atrocity could save thousands of lives by making war seem like a poor career choice. The problem was, Vlad was really good at this. His first major demonstration came in 1459, when he invited all the boyars, the local nobility, who had spent decades playing political musical chairs, while his family got murdered, to an Easter feast. These were the men who had betrayed his father, tortured his brother, and generally made his early life a masterclass in medieval trauma. They arrived at his castle expecting the usual political theatre: some wine, some food, some speeches about unity and forgiveness, maybe a few strategic marriages to cement alliances. Instead, Vlad had them all arrested the moment they sat down. The older ones, the ones who had actually participated in his family's deaths, were impaled immediately. The younger ones, who might still be useful, were marched off to rebuild his mountain fortress, at gunpoint, in chains, in their fancy Easter clothes, which had probably cost more than most people's houses. This wasn't just revenge. This was a job interview for the position of absolute ruler, and the boyars were his references. He wasn't asking them to like him. He was informing them that the previous system of government, where the nobility could murder rulers they didn't like, was now permanently closed for business. Word of the Easter massacre spread through Wallachia like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be incredibly supportive of their new prince. Tax collection became amazingly efficient, border security improved dramatically, crime rates plummeted. Mostly because petty criminals decided they'd rather take their chances with starvation than with whatever creative punishment Vlad might devise for stealing bread. But Vlad wasn't content to terrorize just his own people. He had bigger ambitions. The Ottoman Empire, at this point in history, was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the medieval world. They had conquered Constantinople, controlled most of the eastern Mediterranean, and were systematically working their way through Europe like a very well-organized plague. When they demanded tribute from Wallachia, a reasonable request, given that they could crush the country like a bug, of Vlad invited their ambassadors to dinner. The Ottomans arrived expecting the usual negotiations. Tribute was a normal part of medieval geopolitics. Small countries paid large countries to avoid being conquered. Everyone understood the rules. You pay your taxes. You keep your throne. Everyone stays happy. Vlad served them an excellent meal and listened politely to their demands. Then he asked them to remove their turbans as a sign of respect for his Christian court. When they explained that their religious customs prevented them from removing their headwear, Vlad nodded understandingly and had their turbans nailed to their skulls. This was not, as you might imagine, well received in Ottoman diplomatic circles. Sultan Mehmed Sikim, the man who had conquered the supposedly unconquerable Constantinople, decided that this upstart Wallachian prince needed a lesson in proper international relations. He assembled an army of 60,000 men, roughly 10 times the entire population of Vlad's capital city, and marched north to deliver some corrective education. Most rulers in this situation would have surrendered immediately, fled to another country, or tried to negotiate a face-saving compromise. Vlad decided to give the Ottoman Empire a demonstration of why picking fights with Wallachians was bad for one's health and social calendar. He started by evacuating his own people from the path of the Ottoman advance, burning every farm, poisoning every well, and destroying every bridge. The Ottoman army found themselves marching through a wasteland where nothing edible or drinkable remained. Then Vlad began his night raids. These weren't the noble cavalry charges you see in movies. These were precision strikes designed to maximize psychological damage while minimizing actual military risk. Small groups of Wallachian soldiers would slip into the Ottoman camp after midnight, kill as many men as possible in the most horrific ways imaginable, then vanish back into the darkness. They would target officers first, then anyone who looked important, then random soldiers just to keep everyone nervous. The psychological warfare was exquisite. Ottoman soldiers started sleeping in their armor. Officers began traveling with multiple bodyguards. Everyone became suspicious of everyone else. Morale, which had started high after all. They were crushing a tiny kingdom with a crazy ruler began to crumble like weak old bread. Then came the night attack. On June 17, 1462, Vlad personally led 10,000 men in a midnight assault on the Ottoman main camp. The goal wasn't to win a traditional battle. That would have been suicide. The goal was to kill Sultan Mehmed II and end the war in a single stroke. Picture this 60,000 battle, hardened Ottoman soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, sleeping peacefully in what they assumed was a secure camp. Suddenly, in the darkest hours before dawn, 10,000 screaming Wallachians materialize out of the night like something from a fever dream. They're not trying to capture territory or loot supplies. They're trying to murder everyone they encounter as quickly and loudly as possible. The Ottomans, jolted awake by the sounds of slaughter, couldn't tell how many attackers there were, where they were coming from, or what they wanted. In the darkness and confusion, Ottoman soldiers began fighting each other. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The carefully organized military machine dissolved into chaos. Vlad himself, mounted on horseback and wielding a sword with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work, carved his way through the camp toward the Sultan's tent. Contemporary accounts describe him as moving through the Ottoman forces like a force of nature, killing anyone who got in his way with mechanical efficiency. He almost made it. The Sultan's bodyguards, to their credit, managed to keep Vlad from reaching his target. But it was close enough that Mehmed spent the rest of the night crammed into a corner of his tent, listening to the sounds of his army being systematically butchered by what he had assumed would be a quick and easy conquest. By dawn, Vlad's forces had vanished back into the forests, leaving behind thousands of dead Ottomans and a severely rattled sultan who was beginning to suspect that conquering Wallachia might be more trouble than it was worth. But Vlad wasn't finished with his lesson in international relations. The next morning, as the Ottoman army tried to regroup and figure out what had just happened to them, they discovered Vlad's latest art installation, a forest of stakes stretching for miles around his capital city, decorated with 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners of war, camp followers, and anyone else unlucky enough to have been captured during the previous months of conflict. These weren't just random stakes planted in the ground. This was a carefully designed landscape of horror, with the impaled arranged by height, rank, and presumed importance. Turkish officers were given places of honor on taller stakes in more prominent positions. Common soldiers were arranged in supporting roles. Civilians formed the background chorus of agony. The Sultan, surveying this monument to creative cruelty, decided that maybe tribute wasn't such an important issue after all. The Ottoman army, which had arrived expecting an easy victory and some light pillaging, packed up and went home with unprecedented speed. The conquest of Wallachia was quietly removed from the imperial agenda. Word of Vlad's victory spread throughout Europe like the world's most horrifying press release. Christian kingdoms, which had been watching the Ottoman advance with growing terror, suddenly realized that there might be hope after all. If one small Wallachian principality could make the mighty Ottoman Empire reconsider its career choices, perhaps the Turkish expansion could be stopped. Vlad became something of a celebrity in European courts, though the kind of celebrity you admire from a very safe distance. He was the man who had made the Ottomans blink. He was the Christian prince who had proved that the Islamic tide could be turned. He was also, everyone quietly acknowledged, completely insane and probably not someone you'd want to invite to dinner parties. The problem with building a reputation on spectacular cruelty is that you have to keep topping yourself. Each demonstration of power has to be more creative, more shocking, more memorable than the last. It's like being a horror movie director. The audience keeps demanding bigger scares, more gore, more innovative ways to make people uncomfortable. Vlad approached this challenge with the dedication of a craftsman perfecting his trade. When merchants complained about crime in the marketplace, Vlad didn't just increase patrols or impose harsh penalties. He had a golden cup placed in the town square, filled with water, completely unguarded. Anyone could drink from it, but anyone who tried to steal it would be impaled. The cup remained untouched for years, becoming a symbol of how thoroughly Vlad had transformed Wallachian society. When he discovered that some of his soldiers were stealing from the villages they were supposed to protect, he didn't court, marshal them, or dock their pay. He had them flayed alive, and their skins nailed to the walls of the barracks as a reminder to their colleagues about the importance of professional ethics. When beggars approached him asking for charity, he didn't just give them money or have them driven away. He invited all the poor, sick, and homeless in his realm to a great feast at one of his castles. Hundreds of people came expecting food and perhaps some coins. They were fed magnificently, given wine, treated like honored guests. After the meal, Vlad asked them if they would like to be free from all their worldly troubles forever. When they enthusiastically agreed, he had the building set on fire with everyone inside, explaining later that he had freed them from poverty, hunger, and suffering in the most efficient way possible. This wasn't random sadism. Each atrocity served a specific purpose in Vlad's grand design for social order. The Golden Cup demonstrated that crime would be punished so severely that even the thought of theft became unbearable. The flayed soldiers showed the military that corruption would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The bonfire of beggars eliminated the economic burden of caring for the poor, while sending a message about the dangers of depending on state charity. From Vlad's perspective, these weren't crimes against humanity. They were administrative solutions to persistent social problems, implemented with the kind of thoroughness that ensured they would never need to be repeated. The truly terrifying thing about Vlad wasn't his creativity or his ruthlessness. It was his effectiveness. Wallachia under his rule became the safest, most law-abiding territory in Eastern Europe. Crime rates dropped to essentially zero. Tax collection reached unprecedented efficiency levels. Border security was so tight that unauthorized travelers learned to take very long detours around Wallachian territory. His methods worked. This is the part that makes Vlad genuinely frightening in a way that fictional monsters can never be. Dracula, the vampire, is scary because he might bite your neck and turn you into an undead creature of the night. But vampires don't exist, so you can enjoy the fear knowing it's safely fictional. Vlad, the historical figure, is scary because his approach to governance actually solved the problems it was designed to address, and there's nothing fictional about him. He proved that sufficient ruthlessness could create a perfectly ordered society where everyone followed the rules, paid their taxes, and minded their own business. The question that keeps historians awake at night is, if Vlad's methods worked so well, why don't we use them today? The answer, of course, is that most societies have decided that some prices are too high to pay, even for perfect order and security. We've collectively agreed that the cure shouldn't be worse than the disease, that maintaining civilization shouldn't require abandoning everything that makes civilization worth maintaining. Vlad never made that calculation. For him, order was the only value that mattered. Everything else, compassion, mercy, individual rights, human dignity, was negotiable. If impaling a few thousand people created a society where the remaining population could live in perfect safety, then impaling a few thousand people was obviously the rational choice. This utilitarian approach to mass murder made Vlad incredibly effective as a ruler and absolutely terrifying as a human being. He wasn't a madman lashing out at the world in his pain and fury. He was a coldly rational administrator who had concluded that the most efficient path to social stability led through rivers of blood. His domestic policies were just as brutally logical as his foreign relations. When he noticed that the church was becoming too politically influential, he didn't engage in theological debates or try to negotiate a compromise between secular and religious authority. He simply invited all the high-ranking clergy to a conference, locked the doors, and burned the building down. Problem solved, moving on to the next item on the agenda. When he discovered that some of the nobility were still plotting against him, he didn't bother with trials or investigations. He had everyone with a noble title brought to his castle for a loyalty ceremony, then impaled anyone who seemed less than enthusiastic about swearing allegiance. The survivors became remarkably enthusiastic about demonstrating their loyalty at every opportunity. When foreign merchants complained that Wallachian trade policies were unreasonable, he invited a delegation of their representatives to discuss the matter. After hearing their concerns, he had them impaled in the town square as a demonstration of how seriously Wallachia took international trade relationships. Subsequent negotiations proceeded much more smoothly, with foreign merchants showing remarkable flexibility in their business practices. The genius of Vlad's approach was that he never had to repeat these lessons. Once word spread about what happened to people who challenged his authority became a very unpopular career choice. The impaled nobility served as a permanent reminder to their survivors about the importance of political loyalty. The burned clergy discouraged future religious interference in state affairs. The merchant kebabs improved Wallachia's negotiating position in all subsequent trade discussions. But Vlad's true masterpiece wasn't any single atrocity. It was the way he wove all these individual acts of brutality into a comprehensive system of governance based on terror so pure and absolute that violence became unnecessary because the mere possibility of violence was enough to ensure compliance. He created what modern political scientists might call a deterrent-based autocracy, a system where the ruler's power rests not on the active use of force, but on everyone's absolute certainty that force will be used if necessary. It's like nuclear warfare theory, except instead of mutually assured destruction, it's unilaterally assured impalement. The psychological sophistication of this approach is genuinely impressive. Vlad understood that humans are fundamentally imaginative creatures who often fear potential suffering more than actual suffering. A person being tortured knows exactly how much pain they're experiencing, but a person who might be tortured tomorrow has to live with infinite possibilities, each one potentially worse than the last. By making his punishment so spectacularly horrible and so completely unpredictable, Vlad ensured that everyone spent their time imagining what might happen to them if they stepped out of line. The actual victims of his cruelty were just props in a larger theatre designed to terrify everyone else into perfect obedience. This is why Vlad's reign was marked by so few actual rebellions or assassination attempts. It wasn't that people loved him or thought he was doing a good job. It was that everyone was too busy trying to avoid becoming his next demonstration project to organize effective resistance. The few people who did try to oppose him discovered that Vlad had thought very carefully about the logistics of maintaining power through fear. His intelligence network was so thorough that he often knew about plots against him before the plotters had finished planning them. His punishments were so severe that even thinking about rebellion carried enormous risks. His supporters were so terrified of being associated with any opposition that they often turned in suspected dissidents preemptively, just to demonstrate their loyalty. It was a perfect system for maintaining absolute control, and it might have lasted for decades if Vlad hadn't made one crucial mistake. He assumed that everyone else would be as impressed by his methods as he was. The problem with ruling through terror is that it only works as long as people believe you have the power to carry out your threats. Once that credibility is damaged, the entire system collapses like a house of cards in a hurricane. Vlad's downfall began in 1462, when he made the strategic error of trusting his brother Radu, who had been living in the Ottoman court and had developed what you might charitably call different perspectives on effective leadership. Radu had watched Vlad's reign from a distance and concluded that his brother's methods, while certainly memorable, were not actually sustainable in the long term. The Ottomans, meanwhile, had recovered from their earlier humiliation and decided that Vlad represented an unacceptable threat to their regional ambitions. They couldn't allow one small principality to demonstrate that Ottoman power could be successfully challenged, because that might give other subject territories dangerous ideas about independence. So they backed Radu's claim to the Wallachian throne, providing him with an army and a simple message for the Wallachian people: support Radu, and life goes back to normal. Support Vlad, and we'll turn your entire country into the world's largest cemetery. For the first time in his reign, Vlad discovered that terror wasn't enough. When faced with the choice between their terrifying local ruler and an overwhelmingly powerful foreign army, many Wallachians decided that maybe change wasn't such a bad thing after all. The end came quickly. Vlad's support crumbled as nobles, merchants, and common people decided they'd rather take their chances with new management than continue living in constant fear of creative execution. His army melted away as soldiers concluded that loyalty to Vlad was becoming a high-risk, low-reward proposition. Vlad himself was captured in 1462 and spent the next 12 years as a prisoner in Hungary, where he was treated as both a political asset and a dangerous curiosity. Hungarian nobles would bring visitors to see the famous impaler, displaying him like some sort of exotic animal while they negotiated for his possible restoration to power. During his imprisonment, stories about Vlad spread throughout Europe, growing more elaborate and horrifying with each retelling. He became a legend, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happened when rulers abandoned all pretense of mercy or restraint in pursuit of absolute power. When he was finally released and restored to the Wallachian throne in 1476, Vlad discovered that his reputation had become both his greatest asset and his ultimate weakness. Everyone knew who he was and what he was capable of, which meant that his enemies spent years preparing for his return. His second reign lasted exactly 2 months before he was assassinated, probably by his own guards, who had decided that killing him was preferable to waiting to see which of them would be chosen for his next demonstration project. But here's the thing that makes Vlad's story genuinely chilling. He came remarkably close to succeeding. If he had been slightly more diplomatic, slightly less theatrical, slightly more willing to compromise with his neighbours, he might have created a dynasty that ruled through systematic terror for generations. His methods worked. His policies achieved their intended goals. His system of governance through fear was brutally effective at maintaining order and discouraging dissent. The only reason his reign collapsed was that he pushed the terror too far, too fast, making too many enemies who eventually found ways to work together against him. In an alternate timeline where Vlad had been just a little bit more moderate in his brutality, Wallachia might have become the first modern police state, a perfectly ordered society where everyone followed the rules because the consequences of breaking them were too horrible to contemplate. This is why Vlad the Impaler remains genuinely frightening more than 500 years after his death. He wasn't a monster from folklore or a madman ranting about imaginary enemies. He was an intelligent, capable ruler who discovered that unlimited cruelty was an incredibly effective tool for solving political problems. Every authoritarian regime since Vlad's time has studied his methods, whether consciously or unconsciously. The use of spectacular public punishments to discourage dissent, the cultivation of an intelligence network based on mutual fear and suspicion, the elimination of potential rivals through preemptive violence. These aren't medieval curiosities. They're the standard operating procedures of modern dictatorships. The difference is that most modern tyrants try to hide their brutality behind ideological justifications or propaganda campaigns. They murder their opponents in the name of revolution, or progress, or racial purity, or national security. They present their cruelty as a necessary evil in service of some greater good. Vlad never bothered with such pretenses. He impaled people, because impaling people solved his administrative problems. He burned down buildings full of clergy because burning down buildings full of clergy eliminated religious interference in state affairs. He nailed turbans to diplomats' heads because nailing turbans to diplomats' heads sent clear messages about Walachia's foreign policy priorities. There was no ideology behind his actions beyond the simple belief that effective governance required absolute obedience, and absolute obedience required absolute fear. He was probably the most honest tyrant in human history, which somehow makes him more terrifying than all the dishonest ones who followed in his footsteps. Modern dictators lie to their people and to themselves about their motivations, creating elaborate justifications for their crimes. Vlad just shrugged and got back to work. He was a sociopath with a crown and a very clear understanding of human psychology, and he came terrifyingly close to creating a perfectly functional society built on pure terror. The fact that his system eventually collapsed doesn't diminish the horror of how well it worked while it lasted. For 14 years, Vlad ruled over a territory where crime was virtually non-existent, tax collection was extraordinarily efficient, and civil disobedience was unthinkable. He created a society where everyone was safe from everyone else, because everyone was terrified of him. If you could guarantee perfect safety and order for millions of people by horrifically murdering thousands, would that be a reasonable trade? If you could eliminate crime, corruption, and social unrest through the strategic application of spectacular brutality, would you be morally obligated to do so? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the calculations that every government makes, explicitly or implicitly, when deciding how much force to use in maintaining social order. The difference is that most societies draw the line somewhere short of mass impalement, while Vlad never drew any lines at all. He was willing to do whatever worked, regardless of cost, regardless of consequences, regardless of how history would judge him. In his mind, the only relevant question was whether his methods achieved their intended results. Since they did, at least temporarily, he considered himself a successful ruler, and by his own standards, he was absolutely right. This is what makes Vlad genuinely worse than you imagined. You probably pictured him as some sort of medieval Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant madman who tortured people for his own twisted pleasure. The reality is much more disturbing. He was a rational administrator who discovered that torture was an extraordinarily effective management tool and used it accordingly. He didn't impale people because he enjoyed watching them suffer. He impaled people because impaling people produced the behavioral changes he wanted to see in his population. The suffering wasn't the point, it was just the means to an end. A madman might kill randomly, lashing out at the world in his pain and confusion. A sadist might kill for pleasure, seeking thrills from others' agony. But Vlad killed systematically, purposefully, as part of a comprehensive strategy for social management. He was the world's first scientific dictator, approaching tyranny with the methodical precision of a researcher conducting experiments on human behavior. His laboratory was an entire country, his test subjects were everyone who lived there, and his hypothesis was that sufficient fear could create a perfectly obedient society. The results of his experiment were conclusive: yes, sufficient fear can create a perfectly obedient society. The side effects include rivers of blood, forests of impaled bodies, and the complete elimination of everything that makes civilization worth preserving. But from a purely technical standpoint, Vlad's approach worked exactly as advertised. He proved that human beings can be reduced to perfectly predictable, completely controllable units of a social system through the application of overwhelming terror. He demonstrated that individual will, personal dignity, and moral agency can all be eliminated if the consequences of exercising them are made sufficiently horrible. In other words, he discovered how to turn people into things, and he did it with the efficiency of a factory assembly line and the precision of a Swiss watch. This is the real horror of Vlad the Impaler, not that he was a monster, but that he was a successful monster. His methods achieved their intended goals. His policies produced their desired results. His reign, while brief, demonstrated that unlimited brutality is a viable approach to governance if you're willing to pay the moral costs. Every tyrant since Vlad's time has been trying to find ways to achieve his results without paying his prices. to create perfectly obedient populations without quite so much impaling and burning. Some have come remarkably close to succeeding, but none of them have had Vlad's clarity of purpose or his willingness to follow his logic to its ultimate conclusion. They've all tried to preserve some pretense of humanity while building systems based on dehumanization. They've all tried to maintain some semblance of moral authority while abandoning all moral restraints. Vlad never bothered with such contradictions. He understood that you cannot create a system based on absolute terror while maintaining respect for human dignity. You cannot build perfect order through perfect brutality while preserving the values that make order worth having. You cannot reduce people to controllable objects while still thinking of them as people. So he chose terror over dignity, brutality over mercy, control over freedom, and order over humanity. He made these choices consciously, deliberately, and with full understanding of their implications. He was probably the most honest ruler in human history, and his honesty revealed truths about power and human nature that most of us would prefer not to acknowledge. The scariest thing about Vlad the Impaler isn't that he was worse than you imagined. It's that he was exactly as effective as you feared he might be, and his effectiveness raises questions about human nature and political power that we're still trying to answer 5 centuries later. In our comfortable modern world, we like to believe that cruelty is inefficient, that brutality is ultimately self-defeating, that systems based on fear and violence will inevitably collapse under their own contradictions. Vlad's reign suggests that these comfortable beliefs might be nothing more than wishful thinking. Sometimes cruelty is remarkably efficient. Sometimes brutality achieves exactly what it's designed to achieve. Sometimes systems based on fear and violence work perfectly for their intended purposes, and collapse only when they encounter superior force from outside. The possibility that evil might be competent, that cruelty might be effective, that systems designed to eliminate human dignity might actually function better than systems designed to preserve it. These are the thoughts that keep political theorists awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering whether democracy and human rights are luxuries we can afford only when we don't face serious threats. Vlad the Impaler proved that the answer to serious threats doesn't have to involve preserving democracy and human rights. It can involve abandoning them entirely in favor of something that works much better at keeping people alive and maintaining social order. The question he left for the rest of us is whether works much better is worth the price he was willing to pay. 500 years later, we're still arguing about the answer. And while we're having these comfortable philosophical debates about the nature of power and the price of order, it's worth remembering that Vlad's influence didn't end with his death. His methods, his insights into human psychology, his understanding of how fear could be weaponized as a tool of governance, all of these survived him and spread throughout Europe like some sort of political virus. The rulers who came after Vlad weren't stupid. They studied his techniques, analyzed his successes and failures, and adapted his innovations to their own circumstances. They learned from his mistakes while incorporating his discoveries into their own systems of control. Ivan the Terrible, who earned his nickname through methods that would have made Vlad nod approvingly, borrowed heavily from the Wallachian playbook. The Spanish Inquisition refined Vlad's approach to religious dissent, adding theological justifications to make the brutality more palatable to Christian sensibilities. The French monarchy incorporated his insights about the importance of spectacular public punishments, turning executions into elaborate theatrical performances designed to discourage future troublemakers. Even modern authoritarian regimes show Vlad's influence, though they've learned to be more subtle about it. The midnight arrests, the systematic elimination of potential rivals, the use of terror as a tool for maintaining social order, these are all variations on themes that Vlad pioneered in the forests and castles of 15th century Wallachia. The difference is that modern tyrants have access to technology that makes Vlad's methods seem almost quaint by comparison. Where he could terrorize a few thousand people at a time with carefully arranged forests of impaled victims, modern dictators can terrorize millions with surveillance systems, propaganda networks, and weapons of mass destruction. But the fundamental insight remains the same. If you make the consequences of disobedience sufficiently terrible and sufficiently visible, you can eliminate disobedience almost entirely. Vlad discovered this principle through trial and error, working with nothing more sophisticated than sharpened stakes and an intuitive understanding of human psychology. Modern authoritarians have refined it into a science. The technology changes, but the psychology remains constant. People are still social animals who learn through observation and imitation. They still modify their behavior based on what they see happening to others. They still choose safety over principles when the stakes are high enough. Vlad understood these truths about human nature with startling clarity, and he built his entire system of governance around them. He didn't need focus groups or behavioral studies or psychological research. He just needed to watch how people responded to increasingly creative demonstrations of what happened to those who crossed him. What he discovered was that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures who will tolerate almost any level of brutality from their rulers, as long as they believe that compliance will keep them safe. They'll abandon their neighbors to save themselves, betray their principles to protect their families, and participate in atrocities to avoid becoming victims. This isn't because people are inherently evil or cowardly. It's because they're survival-oriented creatures who make rational calculations about risk and reward under extreme stress. When the choice is between resistance and survival, most people choose survival. When the choice is between moral purity and keeping their children alive, most people choose their children. Vlad built his entire political system around these calculations, creating a society where the rational choice was always compliance, where resistance was always suicide, where moral courage was indistinguishable from stupidity. And it worked. For years, it worked perfectly. His subjects lived in peace, prosperity, and absolute terror. They paid their taxes on time, followed the law religiously, and minded their own business with unprecedented dedication. Crime virtually disappeared. Civil unrest became unthinkable. Social problems were solved through the simple expedient of making it lethal to cause them. From a purely administrative standpoint, Vlad's Wallachia was probably the most efficiently governed territory in medieval Europe. Tax collection was prompt and complete. Law enforcement was swift and effective. Public works projects proceeded on schedule and under budget, mostly because everyone was highly motivated to avoid disappointing their ruler. If you measured success purely by results, low crime rates, efficient government, social stability, economic productivity, then Vlad was one of history's most successful rulers. His methods produced exactly the outcomes they were designed to achieve. The fact that these outcomes required turning his entire population into traumatized victims living in constant fear was, from his perspective, simply the price of effective governance. He wasn't trying to create a society of happy, fulfilled citizens pursuing their dreams and expressing their individuality. He was trying to create a society that functioned smoothly, efficiently, and predictably. Mission accomplished. This is what makes Vlad's legacy so profoundly disturbing. He proved that human dignity, individual freedom, and moral agency aren't necessary components of a functional society. They might be nice to have, but they're not essential for maintaining order, collecting taxes, defending borders, or organizing economic activity. A society can function perfectly well, perhaps even better, without them, as long as the ruling system is designed around their absence rather than their presence. Vlad's Wallachia wasn't a broken society trying and failing to preserve human values. It was a perfectly functional society designed from the ground up to eliminate them. Every person who lived under Vlad's rule made a conscious choice to surrender their dignity in exchange for safety. They chose predictable oppression over uncertain freedom. They chose guaranteed survival over possible self-determination. And most of them probably made the right choice, at least from an individual perspective. The alternatives, rebellion, resistance, flight, carried enormous risks and uncertain rewards. Compliance was terrible, but it was survivable. Opposition was heroic, but it was usually fatal. This is the calculation that every person living under authoritarian rule has to make. Is preserving your principles worth dying for them? Is maintaining your dignity worth risking your family's safety? Is abstract freedom worth concrete survival? Most people, most of the time, choose survival. This isn't a moral failing, it's a biological imperative. Humans are designed by evolution to prioritize staying alive over almost everything else. In extreme situations, this priority takes precedence over loyalty, ideology, religion, and ethics. Vlad understood this instinct and built his entire system around it. He didn't try to convince people that his rule was just or beneficial or divinely ordained. He simply made it clear that compliance would be rewarded with survival, while resistance would be punished with creative death. Given those options, the choice became obvious for most of his subjects. They didn't love him or respect him or think he was doing God's work. They just wanted to avoid being impaled, and compliance was the most reliable path to avoiding impalement. This transactional approach to political authority was probably more honest than most systems of governance, which typically require citizens to pretend that they support their rulers out of genuine conviction rather than simple fear. Vlad's subjects never had to pretend they loved their prince or believed in his mission. They just had to follow his rules and pay their taxes. In many ways, this was a more realistic assessment of the relationship between rulers and subjects than the elaborate fictions of legitimacy that most governments construct around themselves. People don't obey laws because they think those laws are inherently just or morally correct. They obey laws because they're afraid of the consequences of breaking them. Vlad simply made those consequences more immediate and more terrifying than usual, which made law enforcement more efficient than usual. Instead of maintaining expensive court systems to process criminals and costly prison systems to house them, he could eliminate crime through the simple expedient of making it suicidal to commit. From an economic standpoint, his approach was remarkably cost-effective. The initial investment in stakes and public executions paid enormous dividends in reduced crime rates, increased tax compliance, and enhanced social stability. The cost of maintaining order through fear was much lower than the cost of maintaining order through law enforcement, judicial systems, and correctional facilities. Modern governments spend enormous resources on police forces, court systems, prisons, and social services designed to address the symptoms of crime and disorder. Vlad eliminated crime and disorder at their source by making the cost of causing them unbearably high. His methods were brutal, but they were also incredibly efficient. He solved complex social problems with simple solutions. He achieved in months what other rulers spent decades trying to accomplish. The question that haunts political theorists is whether this efficiency justifies the brutality, or whether the brutality makes the efficiency irrelevant. Can a system be considered successful if it achieves its goals through methods that most people would consider morally unacceptable? From Vlad's perspective, the answer was obvious. Success was measured by results, not by methods. A ruler who kept his people safe, prosperous, and orderly while using brutal methods was more successful than a ruler who maintained high moral standards while presiding over chaos, poverty, and violence. This utilitarian approach to governance, focusing on outcomes rather than processes, remains controversial precisely because it works so well. It's much easier to dismiss cruel rulers when their cruelty produces chaos and suffering than when it produces peace and prosperity. Vlad's cruelty produced both peace and prosperity for everyone who survived his methods of achieving them. His reign was marked by unprecedented economic growth, territorial security, and social stability. These achievements didn't excuse his brutality, but they did make it much harder to dismiss him as simply a failed ruler or a political aberration. He proved that there are multiple paths to effective governance, and that some of those paths lead through landscapes of horror that most people would prefer not to contemplate. He demonstrated that societies can function very well without the values that we consider essential to civilization. This demonstration has uncomfortable implications for modern political theory, which generally assumes that democratic institutions, individual rights, and humane treatment of citizens are not just morally preferable, but also practically superior to authoritarian alternatives. Vlad's reign suggests that this assumption might be wrong, or at least incomplete. Democratic institutions might be morally preferable, but authoritarian systems can be practically superior under certain circumstances. Individual rights might make people happier, but collective obedience can make societies more stable. Humane treatment might be ethically correct, but brutal punishment can be more effective at preventing crime. The possibility that moral and practical considerations might sometimes point in opposite directions is one of the most disturbing insights from Vlad's historical legacy. It suggests that the choice between good and evil isn't always a choice between effectiveness and ineffectiveness, but sometimes a choice between different types of effectiveness. Vlad chose effective brutality over ineffective mercy, efficient oppression over chaotic freedom, guaranteed stability over uncertain justice. These choices produced a society that functioned exactly as he intended it to function. Whether that society was worth creating is a question that goes to the heart of political philosophy and human values. Is a perfectly ordered society worth having if that order is maintained through terror? Is social stability valuable if it requires the elimination of individual autonomy? Is effective governance desirable if it's based on systematic dehumanization? Different people will give different answers to these questions, but Vlad's reign demonstrates that these are genuine choices rather than theoretical dilemmas. It is actually possible to create perfectly stable, efficiently governed societies through the systematic application of terror. It is actually possible to solve complex social problems through simple brutality. It is actually possible to achieve peace and prosperity through methods that would horrify any normal moral sensibility. The fact that these achievements are possible doesn't make them desirable, but it does make them relevant to contemporary debates about governance, security, and social order. When modern societies face serious threats, terrorism, economic collapse, social unrest, foreign invasion, some people will inevitably suggest that maybe we need to be more like Vlad, that maybe effective brutality is preferable to ineffective compassion. These suggestions usually come with assurances that the brutality would be temporary, limited, and targeted only at genuine threats to social order. The people making these arguments typically present themselves as reluctant advocates for harsh measures, claiming that they would prefer gentler methods if gentler methods were sufficient to address the crisis at hand. But Vlad's example suggests that brutality, once adopted as a tool of governance, has a tendency to become permanent rather than temporary, unlimited rather than limited, and broadly applied rather than narrowly targeted. The logic of terror demands constant escalation. Each demonstration of power must be more impressive than the last. Each punishment must be more severe than previous penalties. Each example must be more memorable than earlier warnings. This escalation isn't driven by sadism or madness, but by the practical requirements of maintaining a system based on fear. If people become accustomed to a certain level of brutality, that level loses its deterrent effect. If punishments become predictable, they become less frightening. If the ruler shows mercy or restraint, opponents might interpret this as weakness and act accordingly. Vlad understood these dynamics intuitively, which is why his punishments became increasingly elaborate and creative over the course of his reign. He wasn't escalating because he enjoyed causing pain, but because maintaining the effectiveness of his system required constant innovation in the application of terror. Modern leaders who adopt temporary, emergency powers or limited, authoritarian measures often discover the same dynamic. The measures that seemed sufficient to address yesterday's crisis become inadequate for today's challenges. The powers that were intended to be temporary become permanent fixtures of the political system. The limitations that were supposed to prevent abuse become obstacles to effective governance. This isn't because these leaders are inherently evil or power-hungry, though some certainly are. It's because systems based on the concentrated application of force tend to develop their own internal logic that pushes toward greater concentration and more frequent application. Vlad's reign illustrates this process in its purest form. He began with specific, limited goals, securing his throne, eliminating immediate threats, establishing basic social order. But achieving these goals required methods that created new problems, which required more extreme methods, which created additional problems, which required even more extreme methods. By the end of his reign, he was solving problems that existed only because of his methods for solving previous problems. He was terrorizing people to prevent them from being terrorized by his earlier acts of terrorism. He was killing potential rebels whose rebellion was motivated primarily by their fear of being killed. This recursive dynamic where solutions create new problems that require more extreme solutions, is characteristic of authoritarian systems generally. It explains why dictatorships tend to become more oppressive over time, rather than more moderate, why emergency powers tend to expand rather than contract, why temporary restrictions on freedom tend to become permanent features of the political landscape. Once a government decides that effective governance requires the systematic intimidation of its own population, the logic of that decision pushes inexorably toward greater intimidation, more systematic application, and broader definitions of what constitutes a threat requiring intimidation. Vlad's career illustrates where this logic leads. When followed to its ultimate conclusion, he became so effective at terrorizing potential opponents that he eventually terrorized everyone, including his own supporters. He became so skilled at eliminating threats that he began to perceive threats everywhere. He became so committed to maintaining order through fear that he ultimately created a society where everyone was afraid of him and he was afraid of everyone. This outcome wasn't an accident or a failure of implementation. It was the inevitable result of building a political system around the principle that maintaining order required the elimination of anyone who might potentially threaten that order. The problem with this approach is that in a society of human beings, everyone is potentially capable of threatening the established order. Everyone has the physical capacity for violence, the mental capacity for rebellion, and the social connections necessary for organizing opposition. In a system designed to eliminate potential threats, everyone eventually becomes a target. Vlad's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and isolation, as he gradually realized that his methods for maintaining power had made him powerful, but not safe. He had eliminated external threats to his rule by creating internal threats to his survival. He had achieved perfect control over his society by making that society perfectly hostile to his continued existence. The guards who ultimately killed him weren't motivated by ideology or foreign gold or personal grievances. They were motivated by the rational calculation that sooner or later he would decide that they posed a threat and would deal with them accordingly. Their assassination of Vlad wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of self-preservation. This is the ultimate paradox of rule through terror. It creates the very conditions it's designed to prevent. By making everyone afraid of the ruler, it guarantees that everyone has a motive for killing the ruler. By eliminating normal channels for political opposition, it ensures that the only remaining form of opposition is violent revolution. By making survival dependent on absolute loyalty, it makes absolute loyalty indistinguishable from absolute treachery. Vlad never solved this paradox because it's probably unsolvable. Systems based on terror contain the seeds of their own destruction, not because they're inefficient or morally wrong, but because they create rational incentives for their own overthrow. Every person living under such a system has compelling reasons to eliminate the source of the terror, and the more effective the system becomes at preventing collective action, the stronger the incentives become for individual action. Vlad's assassins weren't heroes or freedom fighters or moral crusaders. They were probably terrified individuals who concluded that killing their ruler was less dangerous than continuing to serve him. They weren't trying to restore democracy or human rights or moral governance. They were just trying to survive in a system that made survival increasingly difficult for everyone, including the people responsible for maintaining the system. This is why authoritarian systems, no matter how efficient or effective they might be in the short term, tend to be unstable in the long term. They create powerful incentives for their own destruction, and those incentives grow stronger over time rather than weaker. Vlad's reign lasted only 6 years during his most brutal period, and even that was probably longer than the internal dynamics of his system could sustainably support. Had he lived longer, he probably would have faced increasingly frequent assassination attempts, military coups, or popular uprisings as the psychological pressure of living under constant terror became unbearable for larger segments of his population. The fact that his system worked as well as it did, for as long as it did, is actually quite remarkable, and suggests that he was extraordinarily skilled at managing the contradictions inherent in rule through terror. But ultimately, those contradictions proved unmanageable, as they always do. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Vlad's historical legacy. Authoritarian systems can be extremely effective in the short term, but they carry within themselves the guarantees of their own eventual failure. They work until they stop working, and when they stop working, they tend to collapse completely and catastrophically. The question for modern societies is whether the short-term effectiveness of authoritarian methods is worth the long-term instability they create. Is it rational to adopt Vlad's approach to governance if you know that approach will eventually destroy itself? The answer depends partly on your time horizon and partly on your assessment of current alternatives. If you're facing immediate existential threats and democratic methods seem inadequate to address them, then accepting long-term instability in exchange for short-term survival might be a reasonable trade. But if you're dealing with chronic rather than acute problems, then Vlad's methods probably create more difficulties than they solve. The cure becomes worse than the disease, and the medicine kills the patient while treating the symptoms. This is why Vlad remains such a compelling and disturbing figure in political history. He represents both the promise and the peril of abandoning moral constraints in pursuit of effective governance. His reign demonstrates that such abandonment can produce remarkable results, but also that those results come at costs that most societies would find unacceptable. He solved every problem he set out to solve, achieved every goal he established for himself, and created exactly the kind of society he intended to create. By any objective measure, he was one of history's most successful rulers. He was also one of history's most destructive human beings, a man who proved that success and evil are not mutually exclusive categories, that effectiveness and brutality can go hand in hand, and that some prices are too high to pay even for guaranteed security and perfect order. 500 years after his death, we're still trying to figure out what his success means for our understanding of politics, morality, and human nature. We're still debating whether his methods were aberrations from normal human behavior or revelations about what normal human behavior looks like under extreme circumstances. These debates matter because the circumstances that produced Vlad, political instability, external threats, social disorder, economic uncertainty, are not unique to 15th century Wallachia. They recur throughout history, and they're recurring in our own time. When they do recur, some people will inevitably suggest that maybe we need leaders more like Vlad, rulers who are willing to do whatever it takes to restore order and security regardless of moral considerations. These suggestions will be accompanied by assurances that the brutality would be temporary, the targets would be limited, and the methods would be abandoned as soon as the crisis passes. But Vlad's example suggests that these assurances are probably meaningless. Brutality, once adopted, tends to become permanent. Targets, once identified, tend to multiply. Methods, once implemented, tend to become institutionalized. The ruler who begins by impaling criminals ends by impaling anyone who might potentially become a criminal. The government that starts by eliminating genuine threats ends by defining everyone as a potential threat. The system that promises to restore normal order ends by making normal order impossible. This is the real horror of Vlad the Impaler, not that he was a monster, but that he was a successful monster whose success demonstrated that monstrous methods can produce desirable results. He proved that the road to social stability, economic prosperity, and political order sometimes runs through forests of impaled human beings. Whether that road is worth traveling is a choice that every society has to make for itself. But Vlad's reign demonstrates that it is a real choice rather than a theoretical dilemma, and that the consequences of making it extend far beyond the immediate costs in human suffering. They extend into the basic question of what kind of society is worth preserving, and what kind of methods are acceptable for preserving it. They force us to confront the possibility that some problems can only be solved through means that make the solutions worse than the problems. And they remind us that the price of perfect order might be the elimination of everything that makes order worth having in the first place. This is why Vlad the Impaler remains worse than you imagine he died, not because his cruelty was more extreme than you thought, but because his success was more complete than you feared it might be.